This is chapter 4 and 5 of Who is Gandhi? Chapter 4, Truth Force. When he finished his work on the court case in Pretoria, Gandhi felt that he still had a job to do. Thus, God laid the foundations of my life in South Africa and sowed the seed of the fight for national self-respect, Gandhi wrote. In 1894, Gandhi set up the Natal Indian Congress so that Indians could be involved in government. Gandhi was becoming a leader in the Indian community. Indians had very few rights in the colonies and territories in South Africa. They had to pay extra taxes. They could not walk on public footpaths. They could not go out after 9 at night without a permit. They were told that the only legal marriages were between Christians, so their own marriages were considered invalid. They were not allowed to vote for their leaders. Gandhi remembered one night when a police officer shoved him off a sidewalk. Once, one of these men, without giving me the slightest warning, without even asking me to leave the footpath, pushed and kicked me into the street. In 1896, after 3 years abroad, Gandhi returned to India. It was not easy for him to leave his important work with the Natal Indian Congress behind, but Gandhi wanted his family to join him in South Africa. So Kasturbai, a nephew, and his 2 sons, now ages 9 and 5, made the return trip with him. Once they arrived in Natal, Gandhi insisted that they dress in uncomfortable clothing, such as stockings and shoes, and use utensils such as knives and forks, like most Indians in South Africa. Kasturbai did her best to follow her husband's wishes in running her new South African household, but she did not always agree with him. Gandhi and Kasturbai's family grew as they welcomed 2 more sons, Ramdas and Devdas. Gandhi kept working as a lawyer, but he never stopped working for the rights of Indian people living in South Africa. In 1899, the Boer War began between the Dutch Boers and the British. Gandhi felt the best way to get the British to treat Indians well was to support the government. He put together an Indian ambulance corps with more than 1,000 volunteers. They collected soldiers from the battlefield and nursed them back to health. But this loyalty did not pay off. The British government continued to limit Indians' rights. Gandhi found other ways to pull the Indian community of South Africa together. In 1903, he started work on a weekly journal called The Indian Opinion. He wrote articles about what was happening in the government, and he shared his ideas for ways to treat sickness with natural medicines, and he also wrote about the benefits of a vegetarian diet. In South Africa, Gandhi developed his philosophy of life. He called it the Satyagraha, from the word Satya, truth, and Agraha, force, truth force, because the weapon he used against the unfair treatment of the Indian population. This included ideas about non-cooperation, non-violence, and non-possession. Non-cooperation or civil disobedience means non-violent ways of breaking a law if the law is unfair. Non-violence means doing no harm and loving others instead of fighting them. And non-possession means living a simple life with very few possessions and using only what one needs and never more. In 1906, non-cooperation was put to the test. In Transvaal, the government passed a law that Gandhi called the Black Act. Indians had to register with the government. Every man, woman, and child over 8 had to be fingerprinted and given certificates. And at any time, police could stop Indians to prove that they had registered, or even search their homes if they wished. No other group was required to register in this way. I saw nothing in it except hatred of Indians, Gandhi later wrote. Gandhi urged Indians to use his Satyagraha and not register. Gandhi and many of his followers broke the law and were sent to jail. But Gandhi saw going to prison as an honorable thing. He was being courageous for what he believed in, even if it meant punishment. While in South Africa, Gandhi started settlements where those who followed his truth force could live together. Phoenix Settlement opened near Durban in 1904, and in 1909, Gandhi found another settlement, about 10 times the size of the Phoenix Settlement near Johannesburg. He named it the Tolstoy Farm, and at these settlements they practiced non-possession by living a very simple life, owning only the most basic items. They studied and prayed, they farmed and gardened, and everyone worked and lived together as a community. Gandhi urged Indians throughout South Africa to practice nonviolence as well. Strikes or refusals to work were a peaceful way to stand up against unfairness in the workplace. Gandhi organized a strike of Indian coal miners. Many of them were put in jail for refusing to work, but they did not use violence. Gandhi had shown the lawmakers that the Indians were willing to take action against unfair treatment. The apartheid in South Africa, Indians were not were not the only non-white group that faced discrimination in South Africa. A small white minority of the population wielded power over an enormously larger black African population. In 1948, the government ruled that all races, white, black, and Indian, and colored mixed race, had to keep separate from each other under the laws of apartheid. Apartheid means separateness in the Afrikaans language. People of different races could not live in the same neighborhoods, go to the same schools or hospitals, ride the same transportation, or even visit the same beaches. White people had the best services, while people of color often lived in poverty and were stripped of many rights. Apartheid did not end until 1991, and in 1994, when people of all races could finally vote in South Africa, the country elected its first black president, Nelson Mandela. After 20 years of hard work in South Africa, Gandhi had finally made a difference. The government passed the Indian Relief Act in July 1914, putting an end to unfair taxes and changing the marriage law to include all faiths. Gandhi felt that his work was done in South Africa. He had only planned to stay 1 year, but it ended up staying for 21. Gandhi had served in South Africa as a shy young lawyer, and now in his 40s, he left as a well-known leader. He would now bring his truth force back home to India. Chapter 5. Mahatma in India. Gandhi had lived away from India for more than 20 years, but his work in South Africa was well known in India. He had written pamphlets that had been distributed there. Newspapers in both England and India had reported stories of his work in South Africa. His home country greeted him like a hero. Rabindranath Tagore, a famous poet of the time, called Gandhi Mahatma, which means great soul. Indians started calling him Mahatma to show their great respect for him. Gandhi came home with a mission. He wanted India to govern itself. He wanted to show the British Raj that Indians would be loyal to them. He urged Indians to be confident and to act fairly, and he urged them to show respect to the British and to not treat them as an enemy. In return, he hoped that the government would give India its independence. Gandhi also wanted Indians to look at the unfair parts of their own traditions, such as the caste system and the treatment of untouchables. He wanted to put truth force to work in India too. He created a settlement that was similar to the Phoenix and Tolstoy farm communities. The Satyagraha Ashram, the settlement that was on the Sabarmati River near the city of Ahmedabad, Gandhi had carefully chosen this location. Ahmedabad was a center for the textile industry. The people of Gandhi's ashram spun yarn and wove cloth. The business people, I'm so sorry that I'm mispronouncing these words, welcomed the ashram and collected money to help support it. Opened on May 25, 1915, the Satyagraha Ashram members lived like one large family. Besides spinning yarn, they farmed and grew fruit trees. They read and studied and prayed, and they lived a simple life without many possessions. Gandhi called the untouchables of India Harijans, which means children of God. He wished to treat them like any other Indians. But even members of the ashram who agreed, and most of Gandhi's beliefs, did not always agree with Gandhi's teachings about untouchables. In September 1915, an untouchable couple and their baby daughter wanted to join the ashram. Gandhi accepted them, but some members objected and left the ashram. Even Kasturbai was upset. She refused to work in the kitchen alongside the untouchable woman. The textile owners who had donated money for the running of the ashram refused to continue their support. Then, one day, one of the most powerful Hindu businessmen in Ahmedabad drove to the ashram, and he gave Gandhi enough money to keep the community going for at least another year. Gandhi was pleased. The fact that the traditional Hindus were willing to help his efforts at the ashram made Gandhi believe that the change was coming soon. And Kasturbai looked at Gandhi as her leader, and stood by him. Gandhi also cared for poor people in villages and surrounded the ashram. He opened schools in the villages, he taught the peasants that good hygiene could help keep away sickness and disease, and he gave advice to farmers. Gandhi even organized workers in the factories to strike against unfair employers without using violence. The work stoppage of the strikes proved that nonviolence could work for change. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. Since Britain was involved in the fighting, that meant India was too. Gandhi supported the war, even though he believed in nonviolence. Once again, he thought that supporting Britain might help India gain its independence. We must perceive, he wrote in a letter to the viceroy, that if we serve to save the British Empire, we have in the very act secured Indian home rule. Many Indians volunteered for the British army and helped them win the war. But Britain did not reward India with self-rule. When the war ended, the government passed even harsher laws against the Indians. The Rollout Acts of 1919 made it against the law for any group to organize against the government. Gandhi knew that this law was unfair, and it was time to use truth force again. Gandhi called for hartal, a strike, to protest the Rowlatt Acts on April 6, 1919. Word spread through newspapers and local meetings throughout India. For one day, Indians would not go to work. Shops, railways, and farms stopped for the day, and many Indians gathered peacefully during the hartal to spend the day fasting and praying. Gandhi was pleased with the result. The whole of India, from one end to the other, towns as well as villages, observed the complete strike on that day. It was a most wonderful spectacle, he said. But in some cities, the strike did not go well. Gandhi received news that some Indians had burned buildings and ripped up railroad tracks. In Amritsar, a number of British men were killed. Whether the Indians were peaceful or violent, police treated them the same. They beat the Indians with their brass-tipped sticks called lathis, and Gandhi was very upset. This was not how he planned the strike to go. He realized all of India was not yet ready for his truth force. I had expected better things, Gandhi said, and I felt I was a sharer in their guilt. After the strike, British officers worried that there might be more outbreaks of violence. On April 12, 1919, General Dyer, a British officer in charge of the troops in the city of Amritsar, issued a proclamation to the citizens. It stated that no meetings of Indians were allowed. The next day, April 13th, was a holiday. Vaisakhi Day was the beginning of the religious new year for many Indians. A crowd of about 10,000 to 20,000 people gathered to celebrate in the Jallianwala Bagh Square in the center of the city. The square had one narrow entrance and was surrounded on all sides by high buildings. The crowd had not yet heard of the ban on Indian gatherings. They peacefully listened to a speaker on a podium. General Dyer arrived. He brought along 90 soldiers and 2 armored cars. They blocked the entrance, and Dyer ordered his troops to fire their guns on the unarmed crowd of men, women, and children. People panicked and tried to flee, but there was no way out. The firing lasted 10 minutes, and the official British report stated 379 people were killed, and 1,137 were wounded. But Indians believed it was many more. General Dyer saw the incident as a way to teach the Indians a lesson, that the government made the laws and that the people had to follow. But Gandhi was horrified. Many innocent Indians had died in the massacre. Gandhi would no longer be loyal to the British government. It was time for him to fight back. Remembrance. Today, in that same place as a public garden in 1951, a memorial was built in the garden to honor the many Indians who lost their lives in the massacre. Visitors can see these tall walls on each side, some still dotted with the bullet holes. A flame burns to remember all those who lost their lives on April 13, 1919. And this is where our Read Aloud ends for today. We'll learn more about chapter 6 and 7 on Monday of next week. Again, thank you for being patient with me with my poor pronunciations, and thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.